Hello, I'm Elizabeth Miller, student of Advanced Perspectives of Public Policy. My essay was on organisations. So this essay question was vast within the context of politics. When we speak of organisations, we're talking about their diverse interests that circulate the public sector. To tackle this question as a whole would have resulted in a much lengthier essay. So what I set out to do is concentrate this question on what I argue to be the most influential and dominant organisations, and therefore the most concerning to democracy. These organisations are producer groups. So producer groups come under the category of sectional interests. Interests can be divided into three categories. 1 being sectional, 2 promotional, and 3 a hybrid. Sectional represent the interests of a particular section of the community, and they seek to benefit only for that group. Promotional seek change or to secure policy outcomes they believe are for the benefit of society as a whole. And an example of this would be the Red Cross or any organisation that advocate for the environment or for human rights. And the third type are a hybrid, so they have a mix of both sectional and promotional characteristics. So back to producer groups. So producer groups represent the major economic divisions in society. These are land, labour and capital. When answering the essay question, I reflected much on the reading that I undertook on corporatism and how this can be detrimental to democracy. What I found is corporatism was almost like a byproduct of producer groups. So the structure of such groups is based heavily on the success of growth in economic terms, and therefore I argue to be inherently self-interested. So for ease of communication in my presentation, I've dissected the essay question into 4 parts, of which I will take you through. So 1 is what has happened since the end of the 19th century. Part 2, numerous schools of thought have tried to understand the nature and functioning of organisations in order to make them more democratic. Part 3, how should organisations be understood? And 4, are some organisations better than others? Okay, part 1. Since the end of the 19th century. So what happened in the 19th century? This was the height of the Industrial Revolution of discovery and invention. People were now more mobile than ever with the establishment of railroads. This was a pivotal point in human history. Organisation structures of this time were based upon the theories that advocated structure and repetition. Notable in Constantine's writing is management consultant F.W. Taylor's extreme management theory. Taylor's theory inspired Henry Ford and the management of his factories. This kind of thinking eventually made its way into the public sector. So here we can see the merging of economics with politics. It was during this time that the realisation occurred to various schools of thought that people's nature was inherently self-interested under the conditions of pressure and persuasion. So it was George Stigler, I'm not sure how to pronounce that one. Anyway, George Stigler in 1971 produced very important work. He discovered what we call the major social cleavages or social divisions in society. So we hear these terms again: land, labour and capital. The most important element of his theory is the integration of the analysis of political behaviour with the larger body of economic analysis. Politicians are presumed to be self-interested maximisers. This means that the interest groups can influence the outcomes of the political process by providing financial or other support to politicians. So George Stigler, in brief, he uses a simple model of regulation. So there is the regulator, this is government. So the government faces special interest pressures from producers and electoral pressures from the consumer. The special interest pressure is always more persuasive, so producers always win. Regulations are passed only for the benefit of large firms and not for the benefit or protection of consumers. So to sum up this part, after the 19th century, politics became very concerned with economics, and organisations involved with economics only care about capital issues. An example of this point is that farmers will only care about land issues, and trade unions will only deal with capital issues and only protect the interests of their own members and no one else's. Part 2. Numerous schools of thought have tried to understand the nature and functioning of organisations in order to make them more democratic. So during the 19th century, there seemed to be numerous attempts through theories of economics, political science and sociology to understand the functioning and nature of organisations in order to make them more democratic. However, what I found is that such theories failed to meet democratic criteria. In democratic societies, ideologically, power is dispersed. This is pluralist theory. However, under the conditions of self-interest, this power is distributed disproportionately. As quoted in my essay from Considine, from dependence grows dominance, and from dominance the possibility of resistance or conflict. How democratic can a society really be if it is reliant on the gains and successes of competing industries and the wealth of minor individuals? These individuals being the dominant producer groups, land, labour and capital. In a democracy, the people are meant to hold the power. The role of organisations is to empower citizens so they can connect with government and communicate their preferences and interests. But in the realms of producer groups, the reality is that some groups are more organised than others and therefore more connected with government than others. Under the conditions of self-interest, as Fenner outlines in the readings for week 3, people will act individually for the benefit of themselves. So the result of these conditions is that the interests that are most connected with government are the organisations that are most organised. The organisations that are most organised have the most interest in swaying government and policy outcomes. The interests of these organisations are selfish. The economy is the major driver of this behaviour, for money, for the benefit of the short-term future. Producer groups definitely take the crown for the most organised, strategic and wealthy interests of all. Fenner explains rational choice theory that does define this reality. Part 3. How should organisations be understood? So, from rational choice theory, I believe that organisations should be understood as self-interested. Their behaviour is self-interested. Secondly, as stated in my essay, organisations should be understood as powerful vehicles to achieve societal influence. If groups manage to get organised and channel the power that is dispersed, they have more power than any individual in bringing forward their desired outcomes. They are more efficient. In a complex society, this is needed. The question is, whose interests do they communicate, and how democratic is the process? What I found really fascinating was the relationship between economics and the organisation of society ever after the Industrial Revolution, the integration of interest groups. I believe it is particularly important to understand producer groups as facilitators of corporatism, and that the individualistic interests of these groups are integrated into the government system. 4. Are some organisational structures better than others? Yes, in terms of democracy, some organisations are better than others. It is essential to consider whose interests are really represented. There appears to be paradoxes in the structure of organisations that conflict on opposing factors. For example, membership numbers. The larger the group, the more opportunity there is to free ride. However, the larger the group, the more powerful they are. On the other hand, the smaller the group, the more focused they are, and the easier they are to organise and mobilise. However, the smaller they are, the less powerful they are. In my essay, I posed the rhetorical question, how can democracy and corporatism coexist? I'm not entirely sure of the answer myself. An interesting point is that democracy is not about prosperity, as economics is. The world has simply become littered with authoritarian market-based societies. That is one opinion. In an interest group, such as the Firefighters Union, there are high membership rates, and it is democratic as the leaders are voted in, and everyone gets the opportunity to vote who is involved in the union. Though unions are categorised as a sectional interest group, as are producer groups, their organisational structure is better than producer groups are, and more democratic. At the end of the day, the business sector has a special kind of influence with government, and once again, going back to how I approach this question, this is the reason why I chose to focus my essay specifically on producer groups. Democracy is a very interesting term today. Today's society is heavily criticised by some thinkers as being in a state of crisis where the majority of the population are excluded at the expense of their being elites. So these are the multinationals, individual billionaires, and the ones who have access to the highest education. I wonder, is this really the case? Or are the majority simply free riders and not wanting to participate in society? Is the majority simply ignorant towards democracy, or are the elite arrogant? It is argued by Saul J.R. that if individuals don't occupy their legitimate position, then it will be occupied by God, King, or a coalition of interest groups. If citizens do not exercise the powers conferred by their legitimacy, others will. Either way, democracy is neglected as organisations, the structure of producer groups is the most undemocratic. Is there any room for the conscious and responsible citizen? So, to conclude my presentation, from the early structures of organisations inspired by the systems of the Industrial Revolution, efficiency and productivity were optimised in the organisation of society. Ever after the 19th century, the responsiveness of organisations has been huge, largely by the interested individuals of which public policy affects greatly. But has democracy been lost throughout this process of structuring? Power has been given to the people, yes, and as the world becomes so widely complicated, there has been a certain minor group of people who take the majority of the people power. This is the imbalance of which I have talked about. The human aspect of organisations seems to be getting weaker, but just how society can actually be more efficient, productive, and responsive, as well as being more democratic or human, is a concerning thought. Especially after the criticism of the unconscious civilization written by Saul J.R. Here is an extract from the unconscious civilization of which I read and I would like to share. I found it incredibly insightful. I will leave you with this thought-provoking paragraph on societal organisation. Some people believe that bureaucracy has taken over. The 20th century has an explosion of all types of management. Our entire education system is aimed at creating managers of every sort. Managers of the government, yes, but business is also dominated by a top-heavy bureaucracy. I would suggest that today the problem of managerial deadweight is far greater in the private sector than in the public. I would suggest that one of the key reasons that the private sector has been unable to revive itself over the last 2 decades has been a lack of creativity brought on by a managerial rather than creative owner-based leadership. A second key reason is that the cost of the managerial superstructure is now far too heavy to produce substructure. The managers are weighing the economy down. It's therefore naive to suggest that smaller government will provide reinvigoration. Responsibility will have simply been transferred to an equally, if not more, sluggish bureaucracy in the private sector. People become so obsessed with hating government that they forget it's meant to be their government. It's the only powerful public force that they have purchase on. Thanks for listening.